I'm going to give you a little reminder. Positive plus positive is going to always give you a positive number. Negative plus negative is always going to give you a negative number. Positive plus negative or negative plus positive can give you positive or negative. And whatever you choose is going to depend upon the numbers that are actually given to you in your problem. So let's leave this here, and I won't erase it, and let's just work some problems. So let's say we have 2 plus negative 6. 2 plus negative 6. I've got a positive plus a negative, which is this case, and that's the case we just did. So I subtract these numbers. 6 minus 2 gives me 4, and the negative sign is what I use because this number is the bigger absolute value-wise. Next problem. Negative 2 plus negative 6. So here I have a negative plus another negative number. That's the other case where I already borrowed something and I borrowed some more stuff. So the answer is negative 8 because 6 plus 2 gives me 8. Negative plus negative always gives me negative. 3. Negative 6 plus 2. Again, here it's negative plus positive. So they're different signs. When they're different, I subtract them. 6 minus 2 is 4, and the bigger number goes, absolute value-wise, is where my sign comes from. Notice that number 1 and number 3 give me exactly the same answer. 2 plus negative 6 is exactly the same thing as negative 6 plus 2. This is no different than, 3 plus 2 gives me 5. 2 plus 3 gives me 5. You flip the numbers the way in which you order the numbers. It doesn't matter at all for regular numbers. 1 plus 3 is 4. 3 plus 1 is 4. Flip them around, same thing. Same thing here. I've got 2 plus negative 6. Negative 6 plus 2 should give me exactly the same answer, and it does. Let's say I have negative 6 plus negative 2. So, again, same thing. Negative plus negative is always going to give me negative. 6 plus 2 is always going to give me 8. Because when they're the same sign like that, I always add them. And again, it gives me the same answer because I just flipped the order. So let's do 14 plus 6. That's just regular addition. That's 20. And let's say positive plus positive is positive. Now let's say I have negative 14 plus 6. Negative plus positive, when they're different signs, I always subtract them. So 14 minus 6 is 8, and the sign comes from the bigger absolute value. Right? So it makes sense. If I owed somebody 14 peanuts and somebody gave me 6 more, I'm still going to owe somebody some peanuts. I'm going to owe somebody 8 peanuts. Negative 14 plus negative 6. Negative plus negative is always going to give me negative. 14 plus 6 is going to be 20. So when they're the same sign, I always add the absolute values, and I take the sign because it always keeps the sign of what I was adding there. 14 plus negative 6 is positive plus negative. So I end up subtracting them. 14 minus 6 is going to give me 8, and the sign comes from the bigger absolute value. In this case, it's positive 8. Okay? Now let's say we do something a little more complicated. Negative 2 plus 3 plus negative 1. So I'm adding 3 numbers together. You can do that just like you can do that, in basic math. You work left to right just like you think you would. So negative 2 plus 3 is going to give me positive 1 because I'm going to basically subtract these numbers. 3 minus 2 is 1, and the sign comes from the bigger number. So this gives me 1, and I still have to deal with this negative 1 here, plus negative 1. And of course, negative 1 plus positive 1 is just going to give me 0 because I subtract these two numbers. 1 minus 1 is 0. Okay? Now let's say I have negative 1 plus 6 plus 3 is equal to, you work left to right. So first, let's deal with this. Negative 1 plus 6 is going to be positive 5 because 6 minus 1 is 5, and the sign always comes from the bigger number when we're subtracting like that. We still have to have our plus 3 that's still here. So 5 plus 3 is 8. Right? So 5 plus 3 is 8. Continuing on, if you had 3 plus negative 2 plus negative 1, Then you work left to right just like you always do. So you have this guy right here to deal with. Since it's different signs, you're going to end up subtracting them. 3 minus 2 is 1, and the sign comes from the bigger of these numbers, this one, so it's positive, plus negative 1, right? And that's going to give you 0. Okay, what if you had 4 plus negative 4 plus negative 2? So first things first, you want to deal with this. So 4 plus negative 4 is 0 because you have different signs here. So 4 minus 4 is going to give you the 0, and that's why it's 0. Plus the negative 2 that you have left over here. 0 plus negative 2 is going to be negative 2. Just like, 0 plus 1 is 1. So the rules are really no different. What if you had negative 1 plus negative 2 plus negative 3? Right? So then you deal with what's on the left first, like this. So negative 1 plus negative 2 is going to give you, these are negative plus negative, so you have to add them together and get 3, and negative plus negative always gives you a negative. And then you have plus negative 3 right on the other side of it, and so when you add those things together, negative plus negative, it's always going to give you negative, and you're going to get 6, because 3 plus 3 is 6. So I owed somebody 3 Twinkies, I borrowed 3 more Twinkies, so I owe altogether 6 Twinkies to somebody. Okay, now let's go 2 plus absolute value of negative 4, something like that. Absolute value is not mystical, but you do need to know how it works. So absolute value of negative 4, we said, would be positive 4. And when you add these together, you get 6. 2 plus 4 is 6. Okay? And if you had 3 plus absolute value of 2, it would be something similar. You'd have 3 plus absolute value of 2 is just simply 2. So you would get 5. 3 plus 2 is 5. We'll do one more like this. We'll say 6 plus absolute value of negative 5 is equal to 6 plus, what's the absolute value of negative 5? It's just going to be a positive 5. And 6 plus 5 is always going to be 11. I lied to you. Let's do one more with the absolute value. Negative 3 plus negative 2. So absolute value of negative 3 plus absolute value of negative 2. Absolute value of negative 3 is positive 3. Absolute value of negative 2 is just regular old 2. And so you add these two things together and you get a positive 5. So you see, you just have to think one step at a time. If you're given a, this might really have intimidated you before you started this course or started this section. You have to break it apart. Absolute value gives me this, absolute value gives me this, and now I'm simply adding them together. When I had one like this, I deal with the first two things first, given the rules that I have. And you just simply go from there. Now we're going to do one more type of problem that's really interesting that you'll see a lot. And in your books, you might see something like this. If A is equal to 2, and B is equal to negative 1, and C is equal to 5, and D is equal to negative 3, then evaluate the expression. Now remember, when you see letters, don't be upset by that. That just means that you have represented a letter with a number. So if you wanted to do something like A plus C, this might look really scary algebra thing. All you're doing is you're just substituting in what you know these values are. So 2 plus 5, which is 7. So congratulations, you've done your first substituting into an expression. This is called an expression, something that has letters and numbers like that you substitute into. So let's say you had B plus C. So B is negative 1 plus C is 5. And so negative 1 plus 5, from the rules we learned, they're different signs, so we subtract the numbers. 5 minus 1 is 4, and the larger number gives me my sign. So the answer is positive 4. Now if we had A plus B plus C, again, it's starting to look really complicated, but it's not, because you just substitute in 2 plus negative 1 plus C, which is 5. And then you deal with it exactly the way that you dealt with it a minute ago. You start left to right, so you deal with these. 2 plus negative 1, these are different signs, so I subtract them. 2 minus 1 is 1. The sign comes from the bigger number, so it stays positive. I still have to add this 5 on there. 1 plus 5 is 6, and that is the answer to that. And then if you had something like a plus b plus c plus d, I mean, you guessed it, it's nothing different. 2 plus -1 plus 5 plus -3. Literally all you do is you put in the numbers for each of these letters and then you deal with it. So we already figured out a minute ago that -2 plus 1 is -2 plus 1 is +1, and here's a different way to do it. You can then add these numbers together if you want. So 5 plus -3, they're different signs, so you subtract them. 5 minus 3 gives me 2, and the sign comes from the bigger number, so it stays positive. And these two things are added together, so I just add them together. 1 plus 2 is 3, so the answer is 3. You can do it left to right, just like I said before. We could have added this, and we could have added this one, and we could have added this one. I'm just showing you a different way. You can break the problem up into 2 little pieces, and then add those pieces together. That's perfectly fine. One final problem. If you had a plus absolute value of c, then it would be the same thing. A is 2 plus absolute value of c is 5, right? And so then you would convert that over to what you know. The absolute value of 5 is just simply 5, so 2 plus 5 is 7. And if you had a different letter in here, you would just take the absolute value of that and then you would add it together. So the answer is 7. So that concludes the section on adding integers. It's a very, very important section. Make sure you watch it enough times. Make sure you watch it enough times to really get comfortable with it and to really feel like you can do these kinds of problems. It will make your life so much easier as you move on down the line to have this really solidified under your belt. And I'll give you another hint. The next section that we're going to do on subtracting integers is not going to seem as hard because we've already been subtracting some stuff here. When you start having negative and positive numbers and adding them together, you're always going to be doing some subtraction at some point along the way. So we kind of had to introduce that here. We'll get some more practice in the next section as well. My name is Jason. Watch this section a few times if you need to. Make sure you understand it. I guarantee you that it'll help you in your study of pre-algebra and serve you well on into Algebra 1 and every other math class beyond that.